A mother kneels in a hospital corridor, just clutching at the last memory of her child. Through her tears, she's asking herself a question that has haunted humanity for centuries. If God is good, then why do the innocent suffer? Philosophy frames it this way: if God is all powerful, then he could stop evil. If he's all good, then he would want to, and yet evil still exists. This is the paradox. This is the problem of evil, and it's likely the hardest question that faith has ever faced. This is what's also known as the Epicurean paradox. Dating back from ancient Greece, Epicurus once asked, if God is willing but not able to prevent evil, then he's not omnipotent. If he's able to but not willing, then he's not all good. Hence the paradox. This has often been the thorn in the biblical canon during many debates regarding atheism, the existence of God, and when evaluating what it means for something to truly be all good. There are some challenges to the Epicurean paradox, however, one of the most notable being Plantinga's free will defense, which essentially claims that humans have been granted the capacity to entertain their free will, and in that comes the possibility to choose evil. And interestingly, there's a moral quality placed on free will here, which essentially claims that it is better to have free will even in the face of a potential evil. But an even challenge to that one is that it does not consider anything outside of human affairs, such as that of natural disasters that are also considered evils that an all-powerful, all-good God can probably undo. Then there's skeptical theism, which claims that humans are too limited and too futile to truly understand God's intentions, that we have such a narrow vision of what it means to understand the self, the world, and God, to really understand what it means when there are evils that we encounter, if they are evils at all. It essentially claims that we can't really see the good reason behind the evil that we might be experiencing, and an analog to this could be, imagine a child who doesn't understand the difficult choices that a parent is making for them. But again, this doesn't really get to the core of why evil exists in the first place if we are starting with the assumption that God is all-powerful and all-good. This request that asks us to just trust blindly lends itself to what's also known as process theology, which makes the claim that God is also suffering as humans do, that there's not so much of a disparity between being human and the nature of God, whereby God comes down into the world and has a humane element that suffers with us and is part of us in our journey. Now, I'm not necessarily the biggest fan of these arguments, but that is because I believe that we need to revisit what our assumptions are in the first place. This definition of God as omnipotent and omniscient and all good. What if we reframe God as instead of a top-down enterprise, but instead a bottom-up enterprise? Let's say that we understand there are principles that exist in the world, such as the concept of goodness, of beauty, of order, of morality as a whole, that these do exist as their own almost secular components to the world, and that God is the abstraction that sits on top of them, that permits the space for those to exist outside of the human being. Now, to wrap our heads around this in possibly a more concrete way, when we evaluate something like a painting on the wall and understand its essence of beauty, we can recognize that there is such an abstract concept of beauty that exists. What if God is just the abstraction of that concept? But is it even effective to view God in this light? Does it bear any implications on our understanding and experience of good and evil in the natural world? When referencing Augustine, he did say that evil is simply the lack of good, that there is a natural good that exists, and the deviation from that or God is what we experience and what we call evil. But this doesn't necessarily reconcile our understanding and experience of suffering when we encounter evil. And this leads me to my next point. What also needs to be separated during this debate is the understanding of evil from suffering. Oftentimes, evil and suffering become synonymous with each other. Many times during debates, people will use them interchangeably, but I think it's truly important to also separate these as well as their own distinct phenomenon. The reason being is because evil can be recognized as a sort of intention, let's say, whereas suffering could be the byproduct or the consequence of said intention. They're not necessarily the same thing. Can you experience evil without suffering? And can suffering be experienced without evil? And I would say both could be true in many instances. There are many instances where we're told that suffering is a prerequisite of happiness, where we must sacrifice, suffer, we must live an ascetic lifestyle, and in return we will experience the goodness of happiness. But this is a separate kind of suffering than the one experienced from malice, the intentional evil that we encounter when coupling suffering and evil. Evil, at its core, and very simplified, can be understood as that which is a malevolent destruction, that which is intended to do harm, to abuse, to inflict suffering among people where suffering is not necessary. I do want to get back to this point of what is deemed necessary because I believe it really underpins a lot of what our preconceived notions are about this matter. But before that, I think we should further examine the separation between evil and suffering. If you were exposed to evil without suffering, or suffering without evil, which one would you pick? What do you think that tells you about how you see the world? What is it that you are running towards or running away from? Is freedom worth the price of evil? And why is it that we think evil must exist for there to be freedom when we are not that free in the first place? Where there's so much that we don't know of what we don't know and therefore cannot choose within. So do we feel like we have a reduced human experience as a result of what we just cannot simply conceptualize from our limited human perspective? Of course not. We embrace the human condition for what it is and what we have. So again, if God is all powerful and all good, then it would seem reasonable, if we're going to use reason to the highest esteem, that evil will not be created in the first place in conjunction with good, and we would still be able to live the full corpus of the human experience as a result. Because when looking back at arguments of Plantinga's free will defense, skeptical theism, process theology, even Augustine's lack of goodness argument, do we really think that that's enough to soothe the cry of a grieving mother? Or does it simply offer an abstract consolation, even if that? This is why I think it's so imperative that we need to reframe our understanding of God in the modern world. And here I do want to insert Camus' counterpoint of the absurd. That life is absurd, that it has a strangeness, where we as humans search for meaning where there's none to be found in the world, and therefore claiming that evil and suffering as a whole do not have any divine purpose. This really does take a step back from our modern contemplations or even historical contemplations of the nature of divinity, the nature of evil and suffering, and saying, well, maybe there's no divine purpose at all. While I personally don't subscribe to this wholeheartedly, I do see its importance of evaluating this from a more broad spectrum. What's interesting about this absurd approach, especially in the context of good and evil, or rather evil and suffering, is that it really places the responsibility on the human to decide what it means for them to carry their life forward, and therefore to enact the goodness that is natural to themselves and to benefit the people around them. That it is not the responsibility of some other entity, of some divine inspiration for that to occur. It really places the goodness that exists inside of the self. But interestingly, people might use this as a toss-away, that there's no such thing as goodness at all, and this is where I will challenge that. This brings me back to what I wanted to speak about regarding necessity. There are these concepts of necessity that exist in religion, and more particularly in philosophy, that examine what it means for something to be self-evident, that exists in and of itself and doesn't need a contingent factor for it to exist. When examining the concept of God, or the philosopher's God, God is usually represented as that which exists by way of necessity. That when we look around us, there is an existence at play, and at the core, God is a necessity for life to be permitted. Now, there are also things which exist by way of contingency. For example, if I'm raising this cup, by the way, Tim Hortons has the old school throwback cups if you're from Canada, which is pretty cool. I don't know for how long. Anyways, if I lift this cup in my hand, it's contingent on me raising my hand for this cup to exist in its place. There is a contingency at play. But then there are necessities, philosophical necessities that exist as essences. These are platonic forms, if you may, or things that do exist natural and independently of the human condition, that necessarily exist for life and its incumbents to also exist thereafter. This could also be represented and experienced through the forms of beauty and order and goodness that we once spoke of, that there is a space by which that those can be permitted, that those do exist outside of the self, that God is simply at the centerpiece of. And interestingly, this lends itself to the implication of the importance of God, which is the question of, is it important for us to believe in God in the first place, whether or not there is a God that exists? Does it force us, or encourage us rather, to be more fruitful in our endeavors? Does it encourage us to be more virtuous? Does it allow us to treat ourselves and the world much better as a result? Now, I will let you have that debate there, but there's still this screaming notion of the problem of evil. When looking back at separating the concept of evil and suffering, is there a suffering that exists by way of necessity? And if so, can it exist without evil? Here I want to lean on Camus, who urges us to ask, if there is no God, does the weight of meaning fall upon us? I think this is so intriguing, because how can we recognize pure evil that might exist, or that which is imposed by the meanings we place on the world? This again relates to the evil of necessity and the evil of contingency, if there is one at all. Is all of good and evil but a meaning that we place, it's going to be very difficult to solve the problem of evil. That's why I think it's so important to reshape and reevaluate our understandings of concepts such as evil and goodness and suffering and concepts of God, particularly in the modern world. As you imagine that poor and grieving mother, I want you to ask yourself these questions. Is the problem of evil proof that God does not exist, or proof that our understanding of God must change? Would a world without God make evil easier to explain or harder to bear? And is suffering an inevitability that can be transmuted into how we can live fortuitously, virtuously, and with meaning infused in our lives? I would love to continue these conversations. Please subscribe and make sure to be human.